What's up, guys? In this video, we're going to be talking about whether or not right now is the best time to be buying a short-term rental property or Airbnb. I've talked to a few people recently that are just concerned about, should I really be buying now? Should I wait? Is 2024 going to be a better year for investing in short-term rental properties? Maybe I should just hold out. And so I want to address that head on. I want to talk about my thoughts on generally when is a good or bad time to invest. And right now specifically, is it a good or bad time to invest in short-term rental properties? So let's start out by looking at what would make a time good or bad to invest in short-term rental properties overall so that we can figure out whether or not right now is a good or bad time. So in theory, most people that look at this go, okay, I want to invest in a property when property values are really low. As investors, that makes sense. You want to buy low and you want to sell high. That's how you make your money. And so naturally, we want to try to figure out when the market is going to be at a low so that we could buy then and then sell once the market is at a high. Let's try to do that, right? Think back and try to figure out right now if we're at a low point or a high point in the market. This is going to depend on the area you're in. And I guess it's also going to depend on what happens in the future, which we don't necessarily know. And then it's also going to depend on what happens with like interest rates. And there's actually a whole bunch of different factors, right? And so ultimately, anyone that's trying to buy low and sell high, I think is actually coming at it the wrong way. Because ultimately, there's really no way for us as investors to know what's going to happen in the future. We don't know if the Fed is going to keep on raising interest rates. And when interest rates go up, that's going to drive property values down. We don't know when or if they're going to start dropping interest rates, which would send our property values higher. We also don't know what's going to happen in the economy overall. We don't know what's going to happen next year, the year after that, let alone 5 or 10 years after that. And the reality is some of the best investors in the entire world who do this full time, who, they make a living off of trying to predict what's going to happen in the market, most of them get it wrong most of the time. So the reality is we just can't really predict what's going to happen with property value. So we can't use that as a measure to determine whether or not we should buy a property now or in the future. Because realistically, we can take our best guess at, hey, I think that property values are going to drop in 12, 18 months from now, and here's why I think that, but we may or may not be wrong. And if we're right about it, then great. We can buy then, but we will have also missed out on a whole bunch of potential cash flow that we could have been earning while we were just waiting and sitting on our cash. The other thing that's going to happen is that the money we have saved up is going to start withering away to inflation over that time. So rather than having our money working for us over the next 12 to 18 months, we're going to have it working against us, which isn't really great. And so ultimately, if we try to game the market, even if we succeed in predicting what's going to happen, and we make a guess and it ends up being accurate, we're still probably going to be in a worse off position. But then if we don't predict properly and property values go up and up and up, then what's going to happen? Either you will have waited and then actually ended up paying more for the property, or you're going to keep sitting on the sidelines. And this is what I see a lot of people doing, is that they end up just sitting on the sidelines forever as property values continue to go up, waiting for them to come down, which they just don't, or at least not to the extent that that person wants them to, in order for them to feel like, wow, we're at the bottom of the market. So if we can't look at what's going to happen with property values to determine whether it's a good or bad time to buy a property, what can we look at? Well, we could try to hypothesize about what's going to happen with short-term rentals. And we could say, well, I think it's going to boom here, or I think it's going to bust, and then try to figure that out. But again, we're going to be in this same position of not being able to predict what's going to happen. So ultimately, what can you do? What can you do to figure out whether or not now is a good time to buy a property? Well, ultimately, what it comes down to is that it depends. It depends on the property. It depends more than anything on the property and the deal that you're buying, whether or not you should buy it. There's tons of people that sold properties in 2008 and it was a really bad idea to do so. And there's tons of people that bought properties in 2008 and it was a really terrible idea to do so. It really depends on the specific property. So what we really need to focus on as investors is not trying to predict the market and time in the market, but we really want to focus on time in the market. We want to be in the market as much as possible, not have our money sitting in the sidelines, but we also want to balance that with not being in such a rush that we make bad financial decisions and invest in the wrong property. Because even if we're at the low point in the market, there's still going to be really bad properties to invest in. There's properties that are going to be overvalued. There's properties that you just flat out shouldn't buy. Same thing is at the top of the market. There's going to be lots of properties that are still a really, really great buy even at the top of the market. And especially this is true if you're going to be holding the properties long term. Think 5, 10, 15, 20 years. The longer you hold the property, the more it's going to have time to not really matter what happens in the micro fluctuation in the market. We know that over the long term, the market is going to rise. And so what we really want to focus on is making sure that we get a property that does two things. One is cash flows really well. And this means that you want to find a property that's going to cash flow 15% year over year or greater on your initial purchase price. So whenever you're buying the property for, no matter what type of market we're in, if you're able to buy the property and get a 15% or greater cash on cash return, that in my experience is a great number for a short-term rental property that's going to have you winning. But you also want to make sure that you're protecting your downside. So not only, that's the first thing, is making sure the property can cash flow really well, but number two, we want to make sure that in a worst case scenario, the property is still going to break even at the very least. This is how you eliminate that fear that so many investors have about buying at the wrong time and the property value dropping. Well, when you have cash flow, it just doesn't matter. So I'll give you an example. Let's say that you buy a property for $600,000 and you buy it right before the market drops out. Well, if the market drops out and now that property is only worth $500,000, then you've lost $100,000, or have you, right? If you don't actually sell that property, then you haven't lost that money. You're still just holding on the investment and riding out the waves. But the question is, can you actually afford to do that? Can you afford to hold that property and wait for property values to come back up? And that ultimately comes down to whether or not you can afford the monthly payments, the mortgage payments, taxes, insurance, etc. And so if that time period where the property drops in value happens to coincide with a drop in bookings, a drop in demand, what's your plan? You have to make sure when you run your numbers before buying the property that even if that happens and you do experience a drop in bookings, that either you're going to still be able to cash flow because there's such a great margin that even if you do perform really poorly, you still have enough cash coming in every month to pay for all the expenses, or that you have a backup plan such as long-term rentals, that you can just flip the property over to a long-term rental if you absolutely need to and still have it cash flow neutral at the very worst. Ideally, you want cash flowing a little bit positive even in a worst case scenario. Where people get into trouble is when that property value drops and suddenly they have less bookings that they didn't account for. When they were running their numbers, all they looked at was the best case scenario. They didn't think about what would happen in a downtime. And so in that downtime, now they have less bookings and they actually aren't making enough to cover all of the expense of carrying the property every month. Because that's happening, now they have to either pay out of pocket to carry that property or be forced to sell it. And so for a lot of people, they just can't afford to keep paying for the property out of pocket. They're forced to sell it. Now they really do lose that $100,000 because the property dropped in value and they had to sell it. So they're not able to hold it and ride out that storm. So ultimately, as investors, it's our job to make sure that we buy good properties that we've done proper due diligence on, so that in a good scenario, we can make cash and it's great and it's going to appreciate over the long term. But in a bad scenario, we could still make cash, it's still going to be okay, and we're still going to appreciate over the long term. So to me, it's much less a question of is now the right time to invest. The reality is it's always a great time to invest. There's never a good or a bad time to invest. You should always just be investing right now because ultimately that's the only way to get your money working for you and not withering away, working against you, withering away to inflation. So if you want to have your money working for you, then yes, now is a good time to invest, but it depends on what you're investing in. Any bad asset is not going to have a good time or a bad time to invest in. It's just always going to be a bad time to invest in a bad asset. But on the flip side, if it's a great asset, if it's a really solid investment, then it doesn't matter what time it is. It's always going to be the right time to invest in that great asset. So let me know your thoughts. I want to know if you agree, if you disagree, if you have any thoughts that you would share, any questions, comments, just leave them for me in the comment section down below. If you liked this video and you thought it was helpful, you thought it was valuable, then please hit that like button. It really does help me out tremendously with growing this channel and getting these videos in front of more people. So be sure to just hit the like button there. And then of course, if you're new to the channel and you haven't yet subscribed, or you watch these videos all the time and you are not yet subscribed, please do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out again with just getting these videos in front of more people, and it'll help you. It'll mean that you get access to keep up to date with the 2 new videos we post every single week on this channel. So again, just hit the like button. Let me know in the comment section what you think, and make sure you hit the subscribe button. That said, hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next video.